Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Emily Kuda, and I'm Percona Senior Manager of Marketing Programs. We're going to get started in just a moment. But first, I just want to conduct a little bit of light housekeeping. Can you raise your hand to let me know that you can hear me okay in the control panel? Great. Okay. So next during this webinar, you will be on mute. If you have any questions during the discussion, go ahead and enter them into the questions field within the control panel. At the end of the webinar, we'll take time to answer as many questions as we can. In addition, a recording of this webinar will be made available to everyone within 48 hours or less. If you'd like a copy of the slides, I've made them available in the handouts section. If not, they'll also be sent in the follow-up email. So with that said, I'd like to thank you for attending today's webinar as we talk about Amazon Migration Service, the magic wand to migrate away from your proprietary environment to MySQL, presented by Percona Solution Engineer, Demo. Take it away, Demo.
Hi, everyone. So today I'm going to talk about Amazon's migration services. And the idea is that I give you a high-level overview of its components, the possibilities, the best practices around them, and what they actually can help you achieve. So let's first talk a little bit about myself. So I'm your innocent Percona solution engineer. I live in Bruges, Belgium. I work inside the sales and consulting team to actually build solutions for our customers from an integration perspective. So I talk with our customers to understand where their problems are, and I try to assign the correct service to it. You can find me on Twitter, personal Twitter, at Demo. Sometimes you will see them, of course, those tweets appear in Dutch, which might be a bit problematic for some of you. So what is the exact point of Amazon migration services, right? So, and I think that idea actually came out of the idea that migrating towards a new type of technology is quite cumbersome, right? So it's not that easy to migrate away from, for example, from Oracle DB and move towards MySQL, or from Microsoft SQL Server to Postgres, or any other venue that you want to migrate to the database engine specifically. And Amazon tried to build a silver bullet, right? So I always call it a silver bullet because it is essentially a tool that you can use. It has its functionalities, but it's never perfect, right? So, but it can help you migrate Oracle, Microsoft SQL, or Postgres to MySQL or any other solution. And the idea is that essentially you have not in production environments, because it all is typically very simple if you can actually have a lot of downtime. But with Amazon migration services, the idea is that you can actually have an easy migration plan in which that you can actually switch over the target from your application standpoint to the new infrastructure, which is then kept up to date by a replication host. Next to that, also, it performs the Amazon migration service and the tools that are included in it. Make sure that you actually have some sort of feasibility assessment the moment that it actually looks at your schema and determines what the potential impact would be. The migration service itself, it provides you with a multitude of source databases that you can migrate away from towards a multitude of target databases. And those are not only limited to the Amazon RDS stack, right? So you can actually also migrate to EC2, for example. So let's take a step back and look at what the typical migration process is, right? So if you look at it from, well, those questions, for example, in regards to we want to migrate from Oracle or Microsoft DB actually come up quite often. And what the essential step, first of all, of course, you have the driver, and that can be maybe management or even internally from development standpoint that you want to migrate towards a new technology stack. The driver can be, for example, that the license cost is quite high for those proprietary softwares. But essentially what you want to do is, first of all, verify if this technology can actually can actually support your application. And you have to understand what the limitations will be, what the actual cost would be to actually migrate towards that technology stack, because even although the licensing cost will maybe drop depending on what model you will go towards to, the actual migration itself might mean a lot of application changes, which might require you to change how your application behaves. So there will be an associated cost, even if it's only man hours, right? So that's something to keep in mind, and that's something which is typically focused during a feasibility study. And that's something which I would say is the essential first step when you're actually willing to do a migration towards a new database layer. So first of all, you have a feasibility study. Secondarily, you have the proof of concept, right? So in which you do the actual setup of the infrastructure. You do a schema migration towards the new technology, right? So for example, from Oracle DB to MySQL, and you do the actual migration of the data. And that's typically what's happening in a proof of concept setup, in which that you can actually already test standard functionalities of the database setup that you've created. And secondarily, also have a validation of the data itself to understand, well, has the migration actually successfully happened, right? So from a database perspective, that's typically then followed by benchmark testing, application testing, migration planning, migration, which is then followed by post-migration audit, typically. So you can see it's actually not an easy process to go towards to. And in regards to large infrastructures, we're talking about sometimes weeks, months of actual work to be performed on that infrastructure prior to actually being able to migrate. So the idea with Amazon Migration Services is that it helps you in that concept, right? So if you look at what Amazon's migration services actually, data migration services actually provide to you, because I'm actually saying always Amazon Migration Services, data migration services, it provides you a schema migration tool, right? Which actually is a Java-based tool, which can give you, it's actually a schema conversion tool. It actually focuses on taking the source data database schema and converting it to your target database schema. And secondarily, what it also provides to you is an Amazon database migration services, which are on-demand replication instances, which actually make sure that it can convert transactions which are happening on the primary system and transform or push them towards the new target infrastructure, which is running them as a sort of secondary server. It also, of course, Amazon's web applications are, plentiful. So it also has Amazon RDS, Amazon RDS Aurora as a potential target, or it can work with Amazon EC2 with your own choice of database. Theoretically, you could also use on-premise, right? So that's the fun story about it, actually. So I think the schema conversion tool itself it has some interesting features, in my opinion. And SCT is one of the things which is important. I think what it provides is the schema assessment report, right? So which actually gives you, and then the SCT is typically the first step that you will take, right? So I will talk how you can get started with it a little bit further on. But the idea is that it actually verifies the schema for any problematic behavior, right? So it will actually compare the technology that you're using right now and the database schema that you're using right now, and it will actually create a report with all the changes that have to happen on the database schema prior to moving towards, for example, MySQL or Postgres. And the idea that it does is actually quite interesting, in which that it's really cost-driven. So it will actually create tasks for you to do modifications, and it will do separation based on if it's small modification, which will typically take less than 1 hour, medium modifications, which can take up to 4 hours, and then large modifications, which can be, well, quite significant. And it has the ability to look at the PLSQL code, which is currently available, which is currently active, to understand what type of procedures you're using, and then what the impact would be when you're moving towards, for example, MySQL, right? So which has a different behavior in regards to stored procedures, or let me just say like that, less functionalities in regards to stored procedures compared to Oracle DB. The idea afterwards, so it will create the schema, right? So the conversion schema, And the idea in the backend, what will happen is that it will create an import file. And the import file is actually SQL statements, right? So, which is a bit comparable to what you see with MySQL dump when you do the dump per schema. And it will create something that you can immediately import inside your MySQL database, and it will create those schemas for you. So I think the assessment report is really, really interesting in regards to the schema conversion tool itself. So best use itself, in my opinion, is also, well, I think best use is a big concept, but I think an interesting use for the schema conversion tool itself is to compare actually backend technologies so that you actually can see, well, how much effort would it take for my schema to move towards, for example, MySQL? Would it be more interesting to go to Postgres or any other type of technology, right? So it will actually provide you with a lot of output in regards to what modifications have to happen. And based on that, you can actually also compare and make a cost calculation of the effort itself. And sometimes, in regards to doing feasibility studies, that's really something difficult, right? So there's other external tools which were available, but I think in regards to backends, it is really extensive in how many backends it actually supports. So 2 components. So you have the Java tool, which is, I'm sorry, I'm not a big Java fan. I don't know why, but I have a long history with Java. And database driver that you can actually choose, right? So for the connectors, of course, it has to be Java-based connector. And it supports a lot of technologies, right? So you can actually help do also migration to Redshift. Of course, it supports the typical Amazon backends. I would say that in a lot of situations, it might make sense for very large databases, right? So because it is actually showing you, well, again, it will show you the cost that it actually will take to migrate. And those will become more and more difficult in regards to, well, the cost will be more significant the larger the database is, the more complex the database schema is. Some best practices in using this tool. So it's GVM based. So the moment that it actually starts up, it gives you 3 types of, well, not if it starts up, but you have the ability to modify it with choices for speed, etc., and for or for using less memory. You can also, do your own GVM user options, right? So in which that the XMS is the minimum amount of memory that it will use, and the XMX will be the maximum amount of memory that it can use. It's just, to make sure that the heap spaces are correct. You can, I would run it on Linux right now. I didn't test it on Windows. But the Mac OS X implementation on my infrastructure seemed broken, right? So that makes maybe sense. I would say use it to convert schemas or copy database schemas to the infrastructure. Keep in mind that Amazon Database Migration Service, so the replication agent of Amazon, can actually do it also, but it will try to do its best conversion. So it will actually, and in some cases, it will not work. You can still do it manual, especially if you guys are using the same sort of database engine, right? So you can use, for example, extra backup to do a complete copy of the data set with the schemas themselves, or MySQL dump if you just want to import the schema somewhere else, and then you can actually replicate or use the Amazon migration service. But again, then the question might be, why don't you use maybe the onboard MySQL replication technology? For the normal replication technology which is available to you. So we have schema conversion tool, and you have Amazon Database Migration Service. And the data migration service is really something which is so contains of 4 components really. Well, it's actually 1 component, but it has a multitude of parameters that you have to set up, right? So you have the replication instance, which is actually just replicating transactions from one side to the secondary side. And you have sources, which are, of course, your source data set, your target data set, and events and notifications. The replication instance requires you to actually have replication, well, I was going to say replication active, which is silly because it says the same thing, but you have to have actually some sort of transaction log activated on the source database. And the replication instance will take that transaction log, right? We'll read that, we'll actually follow that, and we'll transform and push those changes to the database backend. And that depends a little bit on how the conversion will happen, what the table mappings will be, etc. But the idea is that you can actually replicate from different type of technology to from, for example, Oracle DB or Microsoft SQL towards, for example, Postgres of MySQL, or even Postgres towards another or towards Oracle. Right? So those options all exist. It also has a multi-AZ option, right, to make sure that you actually can to make sure that the replication environment is not a single point of failure. And what do I mean by that is, well, if you get into the phase where you want to do the migration in production with minimal downtime, you don't want to be in a situation that your actual replication setup will fail, right, with replicating information to the secondary hosts. So it's a bit silly drawing, but that's what it is, right? So it reads the transaction log of the database source. In MySQL, for example, that would be the binary log, and then binary log with row level replication, and it will use a replication instance and will then push, for example, in this case, to RDS MySQL, right? So that's how it works. So sources are plentiful, right? So in my opinion, it's quite extensive. So you can actually, first of all, differentiation. You can have on-premise sources, you can have EC2 instances. You can also have Amazon RDS instances. For example, if you want to migrate away from RDS, which is always a possibility, but also if you want to migrate inside RDS when you have your on-premise sources. So the versions that they support are Oracle 10.2 and later, and Microsoft SQL Server. I think those are the most popular ones in regards to the proprietary database space. PostgreSQL is also supported, MongoDB, Amazon RDS, and the MySQL ecosystem. Targets are plentiful also, so you can actually migrate towards Oracle, Microsoft SQL Server, MySQL 5.5 to 5.7. I don't know if 8 is already included. I need to check that. Postgres, Amazon RDS, MySQL, Oracle, or MariaDB. All the works in regards to Amazon RDS instances. You would maybe say, well, why would you want to migrate, for example? Why do you want to use the migration services from MySQL towards, well, for example, in this case, if I go back from MySQL 5.5 to MySQL 5.5. That doesn't make sense, right? Well, essentially what you could do is you could use it maybe to consolidate information, but you can also use it, for example, for major migrations, right? So major version migration. So for example, from migrating from 5.5 to 5.7 in one go. It is not something recommended, I would say, but it is a possibility to use it, right? So I would not, it's a possibility to use it that way. It's some of the examples that actually Amazon proposes. So the tasks. So if you look at it again, you have data sources, data targets. Then you actually have tasks. So tasks are actual workers for the migration, right? So and the idea with the task itself is that you have to define the schemas or the tables to migrate, right? So and it will, based on it will actually create a trigger on the transaction on the replication instance, and based on if it detects, for example, that table has been involved, it will actually perform a specific task, right? So and it will actually perform that modification and push it towards the instance. So whenever you create a task, you will actually see. Whenever you create a replication instance, one of the things that it will propose is actually migration tasks, right? So, and one of the tasks can be, for example, a full load of data from the source and push it on the target database, right? So if you want to have a snapshot of the database and push it on the target. Additionally, you also can say, well, only migrate plus migrate all the changes, right? So push all the cache changes towards the new infrastructure. So that means, for example, that it actually imports the data from do actually the load of the data inside the target database, and then it will, how you say it, use some sort of caching layer, well, not caching layer, but actually all the transactions that are passing by from the source database will be replayed on the target database. You can also use it to actually filter and transform data, right? So, and that's something I think also is interesting. It can be used as some sort of proxying solution in which that you actually fetch that data and just do a process with it, or a task, or a function with it, which might mean, for example, I will want you to add a prefix to the table table alpha, or I want to transform it from table alpha to table beta. All those things are possible with the tasks in Amazon's data migration service, or in the replication instance. An additional thing which is actually inside it is events and notifications. It will tell you if there is, for example, a problem, right? So if it if it has to scale storage, if it's in a failed state. So based on that, it will actually create events, and based on that, you can actually have notifications, which you then can configure. It's all integrated with CloudWatch, of course. So you have that possibility to make sure that you are informed if something is happening with your replication instance itself. So roughly, of course, how do you start it, right? So, and I think, that's the most important thing, right? So trying it out, especially if you're in the state that you want to try to migrate something to another type of technology. First of all, I would recommend trying to do a schema conversion using SCT, right? So again, DMS can do it in a limited fashion, but it is not something I think, the recommended path is really to do the schema conversion, use the schema conversion tool itself. Make sure that you prepare also your source and target database, right? So for example, for OracleDB, you have to make sure that the archive log is active. You have to create the target and the source database DMS user, right? So for the replication instance to connect and fetch the transaction log, and also to push the information inside the target database. You have to create a replication server, and there's a button, right? So it's very simple. It's just a silly wizard. The thing is, of course, creating it is a wizard, but making the tasks themselves can be a bit more challenging, especially dependent on what you want to do, right? So after you've created the source and target endpoints, you will have to create your tasks to migrate data between the source and the target data stores. And it depends a little bit, what you want to do with it, if it has to be a one-on-one migration, or if you need to do migrations, also a modification on that use perspective, of course. So creating a replication instance is fairly simple, right? So as I mentioned, for example, in this case, this was a very simple setup with a MySQL environment migrating towards Postgres. And you can see that it will actually create, it will test the connection, that will work fine. It will also warn you, for example, of functionalities that are required for the tasks themselves. For example, in this case, it says like, well, your source database is MySQL, and you need to activate binary logs. And it actually also warns you that you need to have a retention ratio of about, roughly about 24 hours to make sure that you can actually, that it actually can cache enough information, right? So Amazon says, 24 hours ought to be enough. That depends a little bit, right? So there's always, sometimes there's ability to have more, sometimes it has to be less, depends a little bit on your infrastructure. And you can also say if it has to drop tables on target, right? So which is important. The table mapping can be fairly simple. I saw in examples and in tests that I did, you can have very extensive and difficult ones in which that you say, I want to filter real specific information, and based on that, I want that to be actually moved towards, for example, towards another location, or have another prefix or something like that. In this case, for example, I said, for any table which is in schema, inform add prefix me, right? So very simple. And that actually will show you for the status, for example, in this case where I did the migration and then data replication, it will actually say load complete, replication ongoing, and it will tell you the type of rule that is currently active for the information. Right. So roughly, how can Amazon Database Migration Service help? Right. So if we look back at our on our reporting in our sorry, searching my words. If we look back at the initial idea of the procedure of migrating towards a new technology, right? So essentially what can help you for the feasibility study is, I would say, especially the SCT functionality, right? So it can help you, well, how can we migrate towards a new technology? What are the limitations? Is there, for example, stored procedures can be sometimes problematic. Well, what do we have to modify? What is unsupported? And it's actually quite extensive, to be honest. There are some manual modifications that you might need to do, but I found it very, very extensive when I tried it out myself. Secondarily, I think the DMS and the SCT is essential for the proof of concept setup, of course, for the actual conversion of the schema, right? So which actually will take a lot of effort. Keep that in mind, that conversion of the schema will be probably most of the time where you will be working on during migrating towards the database, other database engine, except of course if it's very simple. And I think, you know, so essentially what is nice about it is that you can actually have an ongoing replicating host which actually fetches information from a source database environment and propagate it to the target. So you at least can have real testing on infrastructure which actually contains valid data, right? So for a proof of concept setup, that's really, really important, especially also for the other testing phases, like application regression testing, benchmarking, migration planning, etc. So I think, you know, from that perspective, the data migration services or the application instances will help you quite extensively. So best practices for the replication instance: make sure you scale it enough, right? So investigate how much caching is required for the data set. So keep in mind that, for example, if it doesn't fit in memory on the replication instance, it will try to do it on disk, right? So there will be performance overhead. So essentially, what you have to keep in mind is that, well, how much modifications are happening on the source databases while the actual data processing, right, data migration is actually happening. So that, keep that in mind. Verify that. Keep in mind also that parallel import is happening, right? And 8 tables are loaded by default, right, with the replication instance. So it will actually read 8 tables and push them towards the secondary server, and you can actually increase the amount of threads also on that. Keep that in mind. You can keep in mind also that having multiple tasks, like really table the table modifications, it can actually put strain on the replication instance. It can also put strain on the entire setup. So make sure that you keep it simple, keep it light, and at that moment it will work properly. And that's actually something that comes out of the Amazon manual. Also important to know is that the actual load of the information will actually perform full table scans on the source environment. And also make sure that you don't use large blob. For example, try to avoid blobs, right? So as in any situation, that can actually slow down again also the replication instance. Activate the task log to see that infrastructure is, that problems are not happening on the replication instance. Avoid doing the EDLs on the source database. We'll ignore most of them, so keep that in mind, right? So the moment that you're planning to do the migration, do the migration first, then do the modifications on the database itself, right? So keep that in mind. Yeah, also additionally make sure that you disable foreign key constraints, because otherwise, you know, it will have a problem in regards to importing the data. during the full load and also during the cache change apply. So that's something to keep in mind. Also avoid using multi-AZ on the target during the migration of the data, because from a performance standpoint that might have impact. And I think that's really essential. Perform validation. So make sure that you're 100% sure that the data set that you've moved is consistent, right? So doesn't matter how you do it. You can actually use also a validation flag on the replication instances. However, I would really recommend that you also look at it yourself, just to be 100% sure that the data set is still correct for you. So high level, how would it work, right? So we've been this far right now. So essentially what you want to do is, the moment that you have this database server other than MySQL, you want to use the schema conversion tool and go towards, for example, RDS MySQL. That's actually, you first do the schema conversion, so the assessment, schema conversion, and then you move towards, you import the schema towards RDS MySQL. Then you use the replication instance to actually populate the data set and make sure that the RDS MySQL is populated with new information. If you can also use, because they have examples in regards to what if your source is MySQL and target is RDS, you can actually use in a replication instance that too, also from your on-premise to Amazon RDS. But you also have the possibility to use a MySQL dump or actual backup and import it in RDS and then perform replication. So I don't know what you prefer, right? So it depends a little bit. In some cases, people will prefer to have one single tool to do it. But keep in mind that those possibilities definitely exist for you, right? So you can actually also use the standard MySQL technology. I think something which is definitely also worth it, and although you have multi-source replication, which exists, but I also think from a standpoint of consolidating infrastructure, it might make sense sometimes to use the replication instances of Amazon. So one of them would be, for example, to consolidate information and actually push multiple database servers towards one, for example, MySQL RDS instance. And that's definitely possible. You can actually have additional source workers and target them to one single Amazon RDS server. So keep that in mind, that this replication instance or Amazon data migration services is not only for really migrating from one technology to another one. However, it has that added benefit that it actually works, right? So that there actually a possibility to replicate information from, for example, another technology to your preferred target technology. So I think, from a standpoint from Amazon migration service perspective, I would say stay aware, right? So make sure that you're aware of what you're getting into. Make sure that you perform a correct assessment of what's actually going to happen the moment that you migrate towards another type of technology. And this tool is essentially there to facilitate migrations and not to make them a success, right? So it's you who make them a success, essentially, right? So, and that means that you still need to test properly, make sure that you perform benchmarking, make sure that you actually are sure about the backend technology where you're basing yourself up. And also, document your findings, right? Make sure that you have an understanding of modifications you have to take, make sure that you document them properly, also that you understand what they're well, in the future, that you can also relate to them. Make sure that you also imply your development team, right? So, and I think, from moving towards another database engine might require training on that new database infrastructure. For example, working together with Oracle DB might be significantly different than working with a MySQL database, and vice versa, right? So keep that in mind. Additionally to that, understand that part of this technology stack is still a black box, right? So there's not very, very detailed information on how it works interior and from the interior, right? So it is something that is somewhat out of control, out of your control itself. So I'm a bit early, which is good, I guess. So conclusion, I think it's interesting to see that Amazon has invested so many resources in this tool. I see a lot of blog posts, a lot of traction around this. I also see actually a lot of interest in this technology. Next to that, I think, to be honest, the technology, so it really makes it simpler, right? So if you look at the schema conversion tool, it really gives you output which you can use, which you can understand. Next to that, the DMS setup, the data migration service setup with the replication instances is actually fairly easy to use, and you can test it very easily with the AWS database migration samples, which are in the GitHub link. And I think it's definitely worth it because it can make you test other database technologies even for your database setups that you're using right now. It doesn't always need to be a new application where you're planning to migrate towards another technology stack, right? So anyway, that was it. I hope it was interesting for you guys. I don't know if you have any questions, but Emily will probably ping me about that.
Thank you so much for that. Okay, at this time we'll take questions. So our first question is application online when we do SST versus DMS, meaning we have a created replication instance, created target instance?
The application, so your application will remain normally online, right? So I would say that, so for example, it makes sense, in my opinion, to use, for example, sometimes a secondary server as the source for the environment, right? So which actually is so that it doesn't impact too much production. And yes, so your application will remain alive and kicking normally during that setup.
Thank you. And this is a follow-up question. In the target instance, will this utility DMS SST create both metadata for the DB tables, or we need to create metadata manually?
So I suppose that you mean so normally it will create the information. So the indexes, the primary indexes will be created, right? So that's not a problem. It depends a little bit what you mean by metadata itself. But essentially what it will try to do is create the new schema on the new infrastructure. So with the column types, depending on what is necessary. So it will try to take the closest ones. In regards to other functionalities like stored procedures and stuff like that, it will also try to create the other ones. However, it will still warn you about incompatibilities, right? So that's why the assessment is that important. From a replication instance perspective, it will create your new infrastructure, but it will be a limited I call it replicated target set, right? So keep that in mind from the schema perspective, right? So that there's limitations in what it can create.
Thank you. Let's see. Our next question is, would it be feasible instead of an actual migration to create an image database, like say MariaDB for reporting purposes, and keep it synchronized with the same master, like maybe Oracle?
I would say it's possible. I don't know how long it. So the thing is, it has multi-AZ functionality, right? So you have the possibility to replicate it actually for a long time. I don't see a big issue because it's actually going to do the cache changes. What I've noticed with my tests, right, and I'm going to say I tested mostly with open source technologies, right? So not from a closed source perspective. I had instances in which the replication service suddenly stopped working, right? The replication instance suddenly stopped working due to the fact that there was some alter table on it, right? So I would say it's possible, but keep in mind that maybe you then will spend more time in regards to maintaining that replication instance, right? So that you will have to keep monitoring that closely. But yeah, I don't see why not.
Thank you. Okay, this is a two-parter. So we have MySQL instance hosted on EC2 instance, which is over and above 16 terabytes. The maximum size for the amount point for the data directory I can provision is 16 terabytes. So we've gone ahead and moved a couple of tables to different mount points with data directory option while creating the table. We're using Inno Backup to take the full backup of the database as XB Stream. But while restoring, we were facing a problem that failed to find the table space for the table in cache. So we have a MySQL instance hosted on EC2 and planning to migrate to RDS Aurora, MySQL flavor. The problem for us, the data which is over 16 terabytes, which method would be ideal for this scenario, and how much time would it take from your past experience?
Oh, that's a good one. Let me think. So 16 terabytes of data is quite extensive, right? So let's keep that in mind. So I know that so I did tests with Amazon's data migration services with smaller amount of data. Amazon inside their infrastructure did test with EC2 with I think, and they gave examples of 400 gigs or 500 gigs and doing that in a limited amount of time, right? So so I think there is a possibility to do it. I think essentially. So if it's really MySQL to MySQL or MySQL towards RDS or Aurora, essentially, I would look potentially at the other options, right, with extra backup potentially to perform it. But if that failed, it would be very interesting to understand what really is the cause of these issues. So I would say feel free to ping me and or ping Emily, and we can have I can try to get some background around it internally. Hope that helps out. There's no real good answer on it right now, I'm afraid.
Thank you. Let's see. Our next question is, during schema assessment tool, is app online or off? Does the schema assessment tool take some locks on the database?
So essentially what it takes is dumps actually the schema, right? So it fetches information from the schema. So it will not actively be online with the data set itself, right? So it normally will not lock your database.
Thank you. Our next question is, can you show some sample outputs of a schema assessment tool?
I will try to make sure that, so the problem was that I didn't really make screenshots when I was using it, which is a bit silly afterwards, right? So, but I will try to make sure that you have some examples afterwards, right? So I'll make sure that I can send them to Emily to have an example report for it. And probably that will then, Emily, be in a blog post, right?
That would be nice.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we are actually all wrapped up with our questions. I'm going to actually give everybody extra time back in their day. Thank you so much, Demo, for presenting today, and thank you, everybody, for attending today's webinar.
Thank you so much, Emily. It was a pleasure. Thank you guys for joining.